Good morning, everybody. How are you? I'm so excited to be here for this episode of Collect Our Cousins with my good friend, Garrett Bucks. We're already engaged in such an awesome conversation. Before I introduce Garrett, I just want to read my little preamble about why I created Collect Our Cousins. I created Collect Our Cousins, engaging white Americans in the struggle for full democracy to help white Americans like me become more effective in our conversations with white people in our lives, to help us build an embodied anti racist white culture, in the words of Resma Menachem. I'm featuring the people who inspire and teach me the most. White Americans, the battle for our democracy will not be won in courtrooms or in the streets. It must be won in white living rooms, across our dinner tables, in our neighborhood meetings, at our school board meetings. As an anti racist, collecting my cousins often falls to the last of my to do list. Oh, I'll get to that next month. But I'm going to encourage all white Americans who share these beliefs to move it to the front of our to do list. Write a list of your friends, family, neighbors, who you will collect this year. There are 21 million Americans, largely white, who believe that Donald Trump is the legitimate president and political violence may even be necessary. As we do this work, we have to remember that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We have to approach folks with empathy, not from a place of superiority. And when I say those words, the person who comes to mind the most is Garrett Bucks. I am so inspired and delighted to read your words, Garrett. Yeah, I encourage everyone to subscribe to Garrett's must-read newsletter, The White Pages. It's on Substack. We'll put the link in the comments. And also to learn more about your work at the Barnraisers Project, getting more white folks to organize with other white folks. And before we start, I just want to read some of Garrett's words to give folks a sense of where he's coming from. And I say this with my nose ring and carefully curated bookshelf right here. White conservatism and the profound fear that somebody with a nose ring and a carefully curated bookshelf might be mocking you. White conservatives won with sweat and shoe leather by paying attention to and organizing communities that the left was ignoring: non-college educated stay-at-home moms, rural blue-collar workers, etc. They ran up the score because they were the only game in town. The fact that anti-elite discourse on the part of white conservatives is made up and ridiculous isn't a novel discovery, of course. All of this, from Weyrich to Limbaugh to Trump to J.D. Vance, is well-documented territory. What matters here isn't that the message is contrived, it's that it has worked so frustratingly well and for so long. Sadly, it's been the most effective organizing effort in modern American history, not because its targets, white conservatives, are stupid, gullible marks, but because of what the white American left has and hasn't been doing in the meantime. And I'll pause there and turn to you, Garrett, and let's tee off our conversation with that. Except for now I can't. Oh, you are muted. Let me see if I can.
For some reason, it was not letting me press the mute button. That was a absolutely inauspicious entrance. Karen, that was awful nice of you, and awful nice of you to kick things off my words. And I'll claim that I was speechless and not just tech unsavvy. But yeah, I appreciate you starting there, because I know that's the topic I think a bunch about, and I know you do too, which is this question: when we look at white people as us as a group, what has and hasn't happened to create our current expectations for what we are willing to do politically, what we are willing to do socially. And for me, that question of how we got here is, and the dynamism with how we got here, even even cataloging the ways that I think white progressives like myself have really made some big missteps to get us here. That to me feels like very, very optimistic scholarship and optimistic work, because it underneath that is this idea of like, oh, there were steps made by the American right, steps made by the American left that got us here, right? And that means if those are steps that got us here, that means there's probably a different set of steps that can get us out. And I think where I get most hopeless, right, like within whiteness or politics more generally and stuff like that, is when we get into this fear that's all just intractable. Why are we racist? We're racist because we're white people. And as long as we keep being white people, we're always going to be racist. And our only recompense is to become a little more aware that we are racist. There's not a lot of hope in that, both personally and societally. So I love that you started with that, because it's funny. It's not a uplifting little passage, right? In some ways, because it's about, political defeats and political victories and bad faith efforts on the part of the right in particular. But to me, when I wrote that, right, like I was super optimistic, because I was like, listen, none of this is set in stone. We got here because some people did work, some other people didn't do work, and I want the good guys to do more work. So I appreciate that start. What was going through your mind when you picked that passage, and why was it interesting to you?
Well, I think you and I have very similar childhoods in some way, although I think you're about a generation younger than me. So I grew up in northern Colorado, on the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies, in a town that had been a sundown town and remained a hotbed of Reagan Republicanism when I was growing up. It was also a big center of the John Birch Society. Very, very patriarchal, very religious, very, very, very white. And from my earliest childhood, they tried to ban Judy Blume books in our school library when I was in elementary school, and I organized a campaign to keep the books in the school. And
Really?
I named this like thorn in the side of then I got very involved in protesting U.S. involvement in Central America against anti-apartheid. But I didn't have my kind of racial awakening until I visited the East Coast for the first time and saw racial inequality with my own two eyes. I'd only seen it on TV. But I'm very familiar with what you're talking about, how white conservatives organized through, that first it was Ducks Unlimited, then it's the NRA, then it's, the John Birch Society evolves into just this kind of grassroots conservative, and they're all connected, even though they represent not that large of a group of people. They are super united, and they're able to, oh, you believe in banning abortion, I believe in gun rights. Let's work together in a way that we have not seen defined on the left.
Mm. So what was it about, so when you developed that racial consciousness, right? Like when you went east, right? Like what did it change your relationship to your hometown? Did it clarify your like what did it do to how you thought about where you grew up?
Well, this is where I really want to have this conversation with you. My response was to get the hell out of there. When I turned 18, I left, and I have been back like a handful of times. My parents also left at the same time that I did. So I did exactly what you said not to do, which is turn my back on the place where I'm from. Now, interestingly, I was also one of those women arrested multiple times for disrupting the good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. We have a few comments here. I was arrested multiple times for disrupting the Kavanaugh confirmation. And then
Mm,
when I come back home, I see that there's a US congressman calling for the impeachment of Kavanaugh. And then I see he's from Colorado. And then I notice he is a Black man, and I almost
mm,
fell out of my chair. And
mm.
he represents Loveland, Colorado, the community where I grew up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's wild. So the you, and what does that I'm so fascinated by all this, right? Like I because I know that like, I could tell a simple story, right? Like Karen, like of like that was bad. You left that community you were from, but like there's a lot of complicated things that either bind us to a place or that pulls apart, right? And so I think pure guilt about that is probably not in and of itself just super helpful. But I'm wondering, so like the and did you see that pattern continue for you, or did you find that like although that first place, Loveland, Colorado, was not where was not where I found my community, that when I did end up landing in a place like that, there was that did you see that pattern again, or did you find that once you found your place and your roots that the committing to community felt different? And
Yes.
I have no idea. Yeah.
Yeah, well, since then, I've lived many different places. I've lived in other countries, but the three main places that I've lived have been Austin, Texas, New York City, and now San Francisco.
Mm,
And in each of these places, although I was a relative newcomer, I laid down deep community roots, but it was mostly in communities of color.
mhm.
My whole career, I have worked in majority people of color organizations. Most of my supervisors have been women of color. We've always served people of color, etc. I've only ever worked in nonprofit organizations and in for local government. So then in 2014, I had that moment where I realized, damn, I have been
Mm.
focused on the wrong set of people this entire time. Here, I'm like
What was it about 2014?
working with white people this entire time.
What
Well,
happened? Where did that epiphany come from?
yeah, well, this is interesting. I brought you on here to interview you. Now you're
I'm
back.
so sorry. No, I'm just super curious. Please, at any point, I will stop asking questions.
No,
I'm
no,
totally
no.
fine. But
I love it.
this
I
is
totally
fascinating.
love
Yeah.
it. And thank you so much to the folks who are joining in. I see Mindy Leonard. I see Jill Nagel. Um, yes, and it is true, Jill. Activists do need support. That is 100% right. Um, and if folks have questions, please do join. So I began my career in the immigrants' rights movement in Austin, Texas, and I worked for these very shoestring organizations where I had to do everything, And one of the things they had me doing was community outreach. So imagine me, like white woman named Karen, going to undocumented folks or people who are fleeing from the civil wars in Central America and engaging them. So I really had to learn, how to show up and how to build trust and how to listen, very carefully. I would say listening is like my greatest strength.
Mm,
Then I moved to New York City to help immigrants become citizens. We helped 50,000 New Yorkers apply for their naturalization in the wake of immigration and welfare reform, then got defunded in the post 9/11 economic downturn. Again, I was doing community outreach, so I had to figure out, how to get all these different immigrant groups into our centers, or we would go to them to apply for citizenship. Right around the time we got defunded, reports came out that said 50% of Black men in New York City don't have a job. We have 200,000 young adult New Yorkers, almost entirely Black and Latinx, not in school, not working. And coming from the immigrants' rights movement, it was like, what? Like, how is that even possible? Like, immigrants face a lot of adversity, but everybody's working. So why aren't the people who were born and raised here working? And
Mm,
I thought the answer was job training, internships, connections to employers. I did that work for 10 years, preparing young adults of color to go work in corporations in tech. And that was when I really had to face my racism because I was like, why do I have so many harmful and inaccurate assumptions and stereotypes about you?
mm,
And that was a huge growth period for me. Moved to the Bay Area, continued doing that same line of work. 2014, I'm glued to Ferguson, right? And I thought for sure that Darren Wilson would get indicted.
mm,
So when he wasn't indicted, it really tore me up. And I went out to brunch shortly thereafter with two young Black women who graduated from the job training program I used to work for and shared my surprise that Darren Wilson hadn't been indicted. They said, "Why are you surprised? No one ever gets indicted for killing us." And then we start talking about what it's like for them working at these tech companies. They're like, listen, we are grateful for our incomes, our lifestyles, that we can stay here in Oakland while many folks are getting gentrified out. But we are bombarded by toxicity nonstop, a lot of it coming from women who look like you. And that was that moment where I was like, damn, here I am. I thought I was helping young people
mm,
and I was actually putting them in harm's way.
mm,
So before I prepare any more young adults of color for the workplace, I'm going to start preparing the workplace for young adults of color. And again, I've been focused on how people of color need to change. They need to apply for citizenship. They need to get ready for these internships and jobs when I should have been focused this entire time on white people and how we need to change.
mm. It's a profound realization there.
What was that moment for you?
Mm. Yeah, you mean the coming back to white people moment?
Mhm.
Yeah. So you're darn right when you say that. I think you and I have some similar trajectories. So quickly, right? Like grew up in Montana, primarily a few different places, but Montana has my heart. To wonderful, wonderful social justice oriented parents, kind of folks who took me to all lots of church basements with Central American solidarity literature and all that, and some good rice and beans going on. And I think I internalized in that, right? Like the classic white do-gooder internalization, which is, okay, there is injustice in the world, and my job, if I care about injustice, right, um, is to go into other people's communities and where I can see the impact of that injustice, and to either fight against it or provide support or services, et cetera. Right? Like that's where the problem is, right? And I did a ton of classic white do-gooder things. Was a teacher on the Navajo Nation, was a teacher of refugees in Chicago. Ended up leading a nonprofit here in Milwaukee, which is a majority Black and brown city. Didn't really ask the question all that critically of like, should a white guy from Montana of all places like get to not just like come work in a city that's mostly Black and brown like Milwaukee, but like immediately jump to a leadership role in that place. Just felt I care. And where the intersection between whiteness and being a dude comes in is not being really critical of like, my caring means that I need to lead and get the spotlight and all that. And that was going to be my life. That was going to be my trajectory, is not just of feeling a right to be in other people's communities, but getting to feeling a right to be a voice in other people's communities. And it's interesting that you mentioned, I love that kind of origin story starting with Ferguson, because I really admire that you took a deeper look in that mirror at that moment and were like, holy cow, if I care about the community I'm building with folks of color, et cetera, then I need to get over myself and stop assuming that what I've been doing has been right. No, I admire that you did that, because in my set, when I remember being so just like deeply sad about, about Mike Brown, deeply sad about Tamir Rice, right? And was having all those emotions at the same time that I was becoming a dad for the first time myself. But I would love to say that I had that same realization you did. I went the other direction, right? Like I went what I now recognize as kind of a doubling down on my own righteousness, right? So I turned towards white people, but I turned towards white people in a way that continued to distinguish me from other white people. So that's when my writing started, and it got, I was all the diatribes and Jeremy ads and the loud, bold-faced white people, get your act together, you're racist and stuff like that. It's when I, it was like, okay, I can keep leading a nonprofit, but like I'm going to, essentially, get as few white people around me as possible. Have a leadership team that's all black and brown and from Milwaukee and stuff like that. And I will be cuckolded. Like I'll just have like this little cocoon of like righteousness where I still get to have this role. But the way that I'm in this role and the way that I'm publicly being more vociferous about anti-racism and stuff like that will prove to folks this will be the model for how you be a white person. So I give up nothing, right? I give up neither leadership. I give up neither this attempt to integrate myself in communities of color. And so I'm saying this whole time, I'm using the same language you are. I appreciate Jill Nagel and Chassa into the bomb throwing phase 100% through a ton of bombs, right? And I would have used the same language that you just did, Karen, in that moment, saying like, oh, no, I am focused on white people now. But yelling at a group is not focusing on them. Yelling at a group is still separating yourself from that group in a real way. And I think what finally started to come to a head for me, it was a series of realizations, both national and local, taking place around 2016, right? Which is I love that I had this realization, because it's the most cliche moment to have a realization as a white progressive, is like have some sort of Trump-based existential crisis, right? But a few things happened like in order, right? Like there was the Trump campaign was happening, and it just just a bigger, bolder demonstration that, oh damn, we're not just like quietly like systemic racism ugly as white people. We still like to yell it out, and we can't ignore that, right? So you got that, and you having to wrestle with that's us right now. And that was happening around the same time that you'll remember the summer of 2016 was just one of the summers that was just a parade of state-caused Black death over and over again, right? That was the summer of Alton Sterling. That was the summer of Philando Castillo. And here in Milwaukee, we had a night of rage ourselves with the police killing of Seville Smith in the Sherman Park neighborhood. And that night, when I'm always feeling all of these kind of feelings of, I had been continuing to do the token writing and white people get this together and get that together. But as I kept thinking about Trump, throughout the course of 2016, I was like, none of this matters. All that I'm doing right now is only for Garrett Bucks. It is not actually changing a needle of justice one way or another. I'm just trying to stake a little tent in an outpost of Garrett Bucks righteousness in a Black and brown world. And essentially closing my eyes, covering my ears, and pretending if I do all of those things that I will save myself. Right. And I think the night that Seville Smith died, and the night that Sherman Park was on fire just about a mile from me, was the reason why that was another kind of hit me across the head moment. Was there's a story I could tell that pain that was happening in our city, in a Black neighborhood in our city, was happening on my street, because it was theoretically the street that it was happening on has the same name as the street I lived on. Right. But the next day and the next night, I drove the mile to that neighborhood, and I was just seeing, is there any way I can be useful? But trash had already been cleaned up, things like that. And then that night, I was like, perhaps some presence of more white people around here will keep the cops from going off tonight, something like that. But I just realized as I was walking around the neighborhood, I don't know anybody here.
Mm.
I have been pretending and trying to create a world in which this is my community. And I actually know nothing about it, even though it has the same name as the street I live on. And so not only is everything that I'm doing ineffective in terms of whiteness is marching on, more vehemently than it ever has before. And the communities I come from, the communities that raised me, the communities I still really value are falling in line with hate, right? And falling in line with isolation. But this idea that all of us, that somehow I can even inculcate myself from whiteness, and that my community can become my own little pluralistic heaven, and my own little multicultural heaven by itself. That was a lie too. I hadn't actually built community in Black and Brown Milwaukee either. I had just gotten grants to say that I was helping, right? And so when I held up those two lies against each other, right? This lie of efficacy that was actually a lie of isolation from white folks, and the lie that somehow I could run away from whiteness and become a member of another community, right? When I held those up against each other, one lie you can ignore, but a couple lies together, that finally makes you wake up. And so the questions I started asking were instead of these questions of what is wrong with white people, the questions I started asking is, what does it mean to come from a place? What does it mean to be a member of a community? What does it mean to have an identity? And therefore, from those three questions, what does it look like to need the community that you come from? And what does it look like to have a responsibility to the community that you come from? And so I think that turn, whereas no longer asking not just that I was asking the question of should I focus on white people or not, right? I had done that, but I was yelling at them. But when the question became, not of what set of wisdom do I have that other white people need, which is, if you hear that language, is actually just another permutation of white saviorism, just applied to other white people instead of communities of color. The question became one of who am I in relationship to other people? And what is the dialogue between what I can give and what I need from the places I come from? So those questions changed a whole bunch for me.
Wow, I love that story so much. And what were some of the major lessons that you've taken from those inquiries?
I don't think that we're at a moment where any white person in this country knows how to live. I love to use this phrase, in full democracy, in a full pluralistic world, and in a world that where we have dignity and everybody has dignity. I don't think any of us know how to do that. And secondly, of course we don't. Right? Of course, that's the challenge. There has been nothing in our history as a group of people identified as white that would have prepared us to do that. Right? And so, if we start from that, be like, oh, heck, I don't know how to do this in the same way that somebody I love and care for back in Montana who's married to a cop who's got a Blue Lives Matter flag flying. She doesn't know how to do this either, right? And a white CEO who still wants to have an economic system based around them being the ruler of the universe doesn't know how to do this. And across class, across gender, across geography, across political orientation, any one of us who knows how to be white and to live in and contribute to full democracy is lying. So if you start from that point that none of us know how to do this, then what you're going to be curious about is every white person I meet, the curiosity I get to have is, what does that struggle look like for you? Where is the tip of the spear for you that in particular, you don't know how to reconcile, right? And that's, if I'm just out here saying, it's easy to say Black Lives Matter, it's easy to say defund the police, it's easy to say abolish the police. Of course that's easy for me. I'm not a cop. I'm not married to a cop. It causes very little cognitive dissonance for me to think about this, right? But if I'm curious to a friend who's married to a cop of why, of what that would actually mean, to consider the ramifications of your partner's job right now is built to promote state violence and hate and division. And that doesn't mean your partner is a bad person, but that means that there's a mess that probably you and him have not reconciled, right? That set of curiosities of what does it feel like to hear that, to think that, and to try to reconcile that. I don't want to lecture somebody on that. I really want to know how they're figuring out, both for their own sake, both for community's sake, but I also want to feel it out because that's going to be instructive to me, in particular, if I admit to them my own set of things, with over here, the fact that there's a whole bunch of tips of the spear that may be different from me, but that are no less like unprocessed, no less still up in the air for me, right? This question of, you and my work, Karen, right? Should white people in any way have a professional career doing racial justice work, right? That's something that I'm still reconciling in different ways, right? This question of, I'm a parent of 2 kids who go to public, Title I public schools in a big city school district, and right now there has been no pressure in any single way to have in our school experience to have me start having a scarcity mindset. Their school has been wonderful. The school, we didn't think much about the school we sent them to, and it's been great, right? What if middle school's harder? What if high school's harder? What if those kind of things test my values and test the limits and say, this is me being a member of a democracy, right? Sending my kid to just, whatever public school is on the list, even if that's the kind of public school that a lot of other white people run from. Right now, I feel reconciled with that. I might not when they're 15, right? And so this, if I assume that every white person I meet has a whole laundry list of true full democracy moments that they haven't reconciled in their own life, and if I am interested in what those are, both because I really am empathetic to helping them figure out, but also because I'm hoping that their processing will be useful and their advice for me will be useful with all the things I haven't figured out, then that's just a different relationship to folks.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you open with those kinds of questions, how does the conversation shift?
I love human beings, right? Because we're not complicated people, right? We all have a brain that essentially is wired in the same way, right? We have brains that are wired to sense threat, and we have brains that are wired to sense allyship and opportunity, right? And so what you get just immediately is you get the surprise of someone's threat brain, right? And someone's potential fight or fight brain being like, whoa, I don't have to fight right now. This person is not out to win this conversation. This person is not out to win this relationship. This person is not out to make me small in this relationship. So I'm going to give them more of me. And that more can be more delight, right? Can be a deeper insight into what makes this person a really, really wonderful person, in spite of white supremacy. This can be a more of a deeper look into someone's vulnerability, right? And all of a sudden I'm being welcomed into what's really going on for a person. It's just, wonder, think about all of your relationships that have gone from having somebody not trust you to the feeling of being trusted. That's what I get to do all the time. And it's just an absolute joy.
I want to read to you a few more of your words that I find so compelling. White White conservatives have spent my lifetime squaring up their position on Capitol Hill and a strong majority of U.S. state houses, while the white left was staking out a spot far away from any real political influence, but visible enough to provoke the ire of our obsessive rivals on the right. The implications of those choices, both the ones we've made and the ones we consciously avoided, have been massive and devastating. While the white right has spent the past 4 decades consolidating their political power, starting at the precinct level, winning state legislatures, and then, well, creating the political map that currently flummoxes us, the left, which had already become obsessed in the 1960s and 70s with the power of being represented culturally, leaned more heavily into producing and consuming culture. The Reagans and the Bushes of the world may have kept winning the White House, but we had punk rock and a heavier percentage of late night political TV jokers. Still, this creates a deeply cursed dual siege mentality on the part of both sides of white America. American liberals, including often most vocally white American liberals, feel at siege because they, quite accurately, look at how Mitch McConnell and the Supreme Court he created basically get to run the country regardless of which party is in power. American conservatives, again, especially the white ones, turn on the Oscars and hear that or this star of a huge blockbuster say this or that liberal thing, and then go to work the next day and learn they have to go to a white affinity group, which then makes them feel like they're actually under siege. White liberals, leftists, then respond to their version of the siege mentality by doing what we've been doing for decades, throwing out one signifier after another, a land acknowledgement here, a move from POC to BIPOC here, that might better ensure we aren't mistaken for our more loathsome skinfolk. White conservatives, in turn, respond by further destroying American democracy. There are a lot of losers in this particular standoff. American democracy, for one, any hope of a more liberating future envisioned and led by Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous young people, for another. The winners, of course, are irony as a general concept, and most of all, corporate America. There is pretty much no better and more sustainable political arrangement for American big business than a white left that dictates consumer culture and a white right that controls politics. It means lower marginal tax rates and higher annual revenue when your ad guys plop Colin Kaepernick in a campaign or come up with an overhyped tagline for something your industry should have been doing as a default. It's a mess this cycle. And so how do we get out of this mess, Garrett?
I thought I could credit just for naming that it's a mess, Karen. I did my work. I wrote a newsletter. Isn't that the point of this? No, I'm glad you asked that question that way, because I think there's a question that connects with it in the chat from Jill Nagel, who asks, have you encountered any smaller local role models for enacting full democracy, e.g. early abolitionists, Quakers, etc.? First out, shout out Quakers. I am a Quaker. I'm a very bad Quaker because I'm really, really bad at sitting with my eyes closed being silent, but I do my best. And I love the way you phrased that question, Jill. I hope I'm understanding correctly. And I think it does connect what you said, Karen, which was what do we do about that question, right? Which, when I look at what inspires me about the abolitionist Quakers, right? People like Benjamin Law, who was this, a amazing, flamboyant, just given no S's, disabled Quaker activist at a time when many other Quakers were actually not abolitionists. Were not that in Pennsylvania and New England in particular, there were a lot of Quakers who would go to Quaker church, and Quakerism, just for folks who aren't familiar, has a lot of very, very lofty principles behind it, right? Like there's that of God in everyone, therefore you can't kill anybody, you can't hurt anybody, you can't exploit anybody, etc. So it's a no-brainer that slavery should be against Quaker principles, right? And sure enough, very few Quakers owned slaves, but a whole bunch of wealthy Philadelphia Quaker merchants who were part of the kind of Philadelphia New England aristocracy made a lot of money from slavery and were part of banking and financial interests. They were deeply entwined with slavery, but they would still go to Quaker meeting every Sunday. So the Quaker abolitionists, their first target was folks from their own faith who were living out of alignment with the values of justice and full democracy. So their focus wasn't just on let's take down they didn't run off to the south, right? They didn't run off and they were Quakers, so they didn't have muskets, guns ablazing to another community to go fight them, where they focused both their love and their righteous anger was towards their own community, right? Looking incredibly locally, and how do we establish this that us as Quakers are going to be abolitionists, and we're not going to stand for all of the excuses that Quakers in our midst will make from straying from those values. And the reason why I tell that story in that way is when I look at groups right now that inspire me the most, it's groups that might not be like running off, so like a bunch of folks in Brooklyn saying like, oh shoot, we need to move to Eastern Kentucky right now and go make friends with whoever J.D. Vance wrote about in Hillbilly Elegy. It's folks who ask an honest question of like, who is my type of white people right now? And that may be a set of white people that I left, right? Like, Loveland, Colorado may still be your people, Karen, right? It may be the people that you are around right now, though, right? And who are those people right now? How are those people, myself included, most likely to live out of alignment with justice, with democracy, with dignity for all people? And how do I focus my conversations on a tangible set of local actions we're going to change, right? So an example of a group I love, a set of folks that I've had the pleasure of training in my Barnraisers cohorts, is this group called, it's a small collective of incredible folks. You can go to their website called Get Schooled Oakland, right? And they are a group that's connected to broader school integration movements. Shout out to Integrated Schools, a national organization that inspires me a whole bunch. But Get Schooled Oakland, started in the last few months, is a couple white folks, a white parent, and a white former educator who works in kind of education policy circles, and kind of, both of them run in kind of progressive white Oakland gentrifying circles, both of them. And both of them identified that our people right now are a set of white parents who moved to Oakland because they love the diversity of it. They love that this is Black Oakland, home of the Black Panthers. This is an Asian city, and this is a Latinx city, and this is a multicultural city. But when they get to Oakland, either send their kids to private school or try to warp Oakland Unified School District to their needs. Have a few set of schools that they want to go to, make sure in implicit ways, sometimes even using a language of social justice, that more resources go to those schools, and continue to create a situation of disinvestment. And right now, there's a huge school closure issue that has resulted from years and years of policies that of disinvestment for white families in the district as a whole, and investment in tiny corners of it, right? And so identifying that these are my people, this is what we are doing locally that is disrupting local democracy the most, right? At its core, right, we are disrupting the ability for every person in the city, particularly Black and brown people, to know that the school closest to you is going to love you, have the resources to take care of you, et cetera, right? And we know that the way that plays out, where that starts right now, is when a white parent has kids starting to turn around 3 or 4, they start turning to these websites, websites like greatschools.org, local message board, Facebook groups, et cetera, that tell them these schools are bad, schools with lots of Black and brown kids, these schools are good, and it also tell them, don't worry, you can still be a good social justice person sending your kid to this private school because it's social justice-y, or sending your kid to this other school because it's not, right? So they're identifying, okay, this is the thing, broad picture we've done in schools, and this is the first way that plays out in behavior, is we go to these websites. So we're going to start going to community meetings and parents meetings and stuff like that, and we're going to give them a new resource, a new website that tells us different story of schools throughout Oakland, that encourages a different set of questions in how they interact with schools, that gets them thinking about their role in this broader system, and that enlists them to the question of saying, to your question, Jill, that says part of being a parent in a place is making a decision not just for your own kid, but with an entire city in mind, which for me, that is like at the core of participating in full democracy. But that wouldn't work, right? Like all the steps that they take wouldn't work without those folks having a deep interiority, not just the high level problem that the particular white people like them are causing, but a actual sense for like, okay, how does that play out in psychology? How does that play out in behavior, et cetera? Like that you only know if you are that people. In the same way that, Benjamin Law and the other abolitionist Quakers knew the kind of like moral rigmarole that like Quakers were jumping through in that moment to try to justify still benefiting from slavery, because those were their people. And they could yell at them, but they could also keep showing up to meeting every single week and making sure they were still committing to that community.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. I what's really resonating for me, we just had the school board recall that passed by 75%. It's here in San Francisco, with a very small percent of the electorate participating because it was a special election. And now I'm really, really concerned about our district attorney, who is facing a recall election this summer, and how I really need to step up my organizing with white homeowners like me, who I was on the police commission meeting last night about our police chief has unilaterally withdrawn from a MOU with the district attorney, because the district attorney is for the first time prosecuting SFPD officers for excessive use of force. And there's all these parents, or not parents, but San Franciscans on there with their indignation. The city is becoming so unsafe and we need more cops, and we stand behind the chief of police without interrogating, are more cops making us safer? Can we police our way out of the problems that we have? And I would say no. We can't fight homelessness and drug addiction and all of this stuff with police. That's not it's not the right. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to oh gosh, time is just flying by. It's like 8:47. I was going to read this really great passage from Anne Braden about how we can't just organize white people and not talk about race. And we also can't think that if we do talk about race, we're going to alienate, that we have to introduce the question of race.
Heck yeah. And I mean, first off, you had me at Anne Braden. Always. That is, for folks who aren't familiar, that is my Anne Braden is my North Star. In a moment when I find that many other 1950s and 60s white radicals were moving farther and farther away from rural conservative white people, Anne, who was deeply, deeply trusted by the civil rights movement leadership, folks like King and Stokely Carmichael, et cetera, her and her husband Carl moved closer and closer to the kind of communities that everyone else was running from. And so you'll always have me at Anne Braden to begin with. But I also think, like I feel like if we don't have a politics, and by that I mean both our ideology and how we do politics on a daily basis, that believes in the full dignity of the people that we're doing with politics with, then why are we even doing it? And that quote to me speaks to the idea of respecting the full dignity of another person. I have to believe that, I said earlier that all white people don't know what to do right now. Have no idea, have no models, have nothing in our history or our ancestry that has prepared us to have inherited whiteness and to be full participants in democracy. We don't know how to do it. But I also have to believe at the same point that we're not dummies, that we're not idiots, and that we are that we are smart enough, that our brains and our hearts are large enough that we can deal with actual conversations, that we don't have to hide the ball. And I do think that it's necessary. I do think that we make the mistake of often assuming that because we suck so much at bringing up the topic of race with other white people, we just lecture and yell and stuff like that. That means that they can't take it. There's a difference between someone not being able to take it and us being just really, really bad at bringing it up with folks. And Ann Braden was amazing at bringing it up with folks, and that's why she had a different perspective.
Thank you so much, Garrett. As we wind down, I just want to welcome everybody. Next week, I'm going to be talking with Catherine Castro, who is a badass Oakland Black mom. And we're going to be having a conversation about various pitfalls that white people can stumble into as we engage in this work. So I hope you will join us on February 24th, 8 a.m. for our next edition of Collect Our Cousins. As we wind down, I want to ask you, Garrett, if you could wave a magic wand and get white people to either stop doing something or start doing something, what would it be and why?
You know, it's interesting. I think that there's lots of ways you can take that question really negatively and that are fair, right? And I'm excited for next week's conversation because, goodness, there's plenty of pitfalls we can fall into. And in particular, right, as we, a risk I think about quite a bit is as white people spend more time with each other, which I think we need to in order to build liberation. There's always the risk that we become more myopic with each other too, right? That become less aware of everything we don't know, all the ways we're dumb, right? So I think that's crucial, right? And there's lots of ways that are not wrong to answer that question negatively, but I'm not going to. Because I think it's equally important to, if you're trying to get behavior change, to get behavior change from a place of hope. So what I would, if I had a magic wand, it would be, I would want all of us to imagine that both ourselves as individual white people and that every white person around us, the people we come from, the people we ran from, the people we've still drifted towards, the people we're trying to impress, are capable of so much more. That there's a difference between not yet knowing how to be full members of a pluralistic democracy and not being able to. And I think you have to imagine that we're going to be able to, and you have to start imagining what that might look like if we were to. So that's all I want. I want us to be imaginative and to say that I think we're better than what we're inherited, and I am legitimately excited about what we're going to be a part of co-building.
Listen, Garrett, I am legitimately excited every single time I read your brilliant newsletter and follow your work. So how can other folks follow you?
Oh, it's super kind. Love all of our conversations, everything you're putting out there too, Karen. And this series is such a great gift. Folks can find me if you go to my website, which is barnraisersproject.org, barnraisersproject.org. You're going to find a couple links. You're going to find links to learn about our upcoming training cohorts and sign up. You'll also find a link to my newsletter, which Karen, you very kindly quoted from and said nice things about. It's the whitepages.substack.com, which you can go direct to that and subscribe, or you can find a link at barnraisersproject.org. And I'm Garrett Bucks. You can find my name in places and maybe follow me in those places.
And who is the ideal candidate for Barnraisers cohort?
A white person who feels like they don't know what to do. I'll note what I don't do in the cohorts very clearly. This is not the place, and there's wonderful resources on my website. I even share what some of those resources are. If what you want to do is learn more about the basics of white supremacy, about the mistakes we made, all this stuff, I think that in particular, there are incredible educators and trainers of color who do that much better than I ever could. It's not going to be a anti-racism 101 course or 201 course. In fact, we're not going to talk much about the nature of systemic racism, personal racism, white fragility, white privilege, et cetera. None of that. What we're going to talk about is, in your little corner of the world, How do you identify a group of people, yourself included, that might need to do something different? How do you set a concrete goal for what that difference is? How do you make sure that goal is accountable to Black and Brown and Indigenous organizing in your local area? And then how do you have a set of conversations with folks that actually bring them in rather than push them away? So you don't need to know your action yet. You can still be confused about what you're going to do, but you got to have a desire that you are in a stage right now where you don't want to just keep learning. Love learning, but it's not what I do. But you want to start doing something.
Thank you so much, Garrett. And in closing, I just want to thank you because you approach this work with joy, with optimism. I mean, I think it's so important. Anti-racism is joyful, okay?
Heck yeah.
Recognizing the full humanity of people feels amazing,
Love
and
it.
I want us to get out of this crumply, like, guilt-ridden, and trust me, I have cried buckets and buckets of white women tears and real grief. But as we build this movement, let's do it with joy. Let's do it with compassion. Let's really create the imagination comes from the freedom of joy, and I feel that when I read your words. It really just warms my heart and gives me the vision that there is something that we can do, that we are actually capable of creating a much better world. So thank you for sustaining that vision for us, Garrett. This has been a great conversation. Thank you to everybody who showed up.
Appreciate it.
Join us next week. And yeah, have a great day, everybody.